Okay, welcome to week two of Urban Forestry. This week, our second module here, we're going to be looking at sort of the history of urban forestry. And it's not really urban forestry, it's sort of like a look at how vegetation has played a role in cities over time. And I think I said I was going to kind of focus on the United States. For this, but I ended up not doing that at all, at all, because I found some other sources that go into some history and context in a much broader throughout history, a much broader like time span. So there's some interesting stuff in here, so I ended up changing this up a little bit. So let's just get into it here. And when we're looking at the use of trees and vegetation in cities over time, there's some repeated patterns that we end up seeing, especially when we're looking at early history. And those patterns are sort of when humanity is where's my little tool here? There we go. When humanity is or humans are spreading out, to new locations, you see a pattern of we tend to use up those resources that are there. So forests, having been pretty prevalent throughout the world in terms of human history, are a common source of resources. So usually when humans get to a new area, they cut down all the trees. They use those trees to build their settlements and cities, and this is a modern city, but even in history, they're using the resources that were there to build their settlements. And then over time, as those settlements develop, you usually see some reincorporation of vegetation, whether that's in the form of trees or agriculture or something taking place within those settlements. But that usually happens not right away. So the settlements get established, and then as sort of time goes on, especially in times of peace when there's not a lot of conflict, you see more of these sorts of things showing up within the settlements. But then usually what happens is there's a lot of conflict throughout human history, and so we end up, during times of conflict, those resources get used up. So if there's trees, and they end up cutting them down and using the lumber for all sorts of things related to human conflict. And then after that happens, you sort of get a repeat. Maybe the city needs to build itself back up again, or maybe people spread out to new areas and sort of start this cycle over again, where cut down the resources, build our cities, reincorporate a little bit of nature into our cities, and then use that for resources when it's needed. So that's sort of a cyclical pattern that happens a lot throughout early history. And when we're looking specifically at, what are people using this urban vegetation for, there's also some broad patterns here. So plants, were traditionally used for food, obviously food, but also medicine too. And also the ruling classes is something that happens a lot, but like the wealthy aristocratic ruling class usually has collections, and they sort of use it as a place for them to sort of hang out, where they don't have to interact with the regular public, but also as a display, sort of to display their wealth. So these sort of happens in the form of mostly private gardens, sometimes public gardens. We'll see some examples of those. Another common use is in sacred places or religious places that have a lot of meaning to that culture. You might see more vegetation in those areas. There's a few examples of botanical gardens in early history, very few, but there's a couple. And there's this thing called urban green belts that still exist now, and are kind of an older concept that in Greek and Roman times they had some of these things. So we'll look at some of this stuff here. I want to start. So we'll just sort of we're going to do kind of a chronological walk through history here, but it's not exactly chronological. So if you look at some of these older civilizations, we'll start with Egypt. Um, they actually had some of the the earliest description of urban vegetation in the Eastern Hemisphere. It comes from ancient Egypt. and it's called the Garden of Methane. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. It's not this here. This is a different garden from about 1370 BC. But the Egyptian rulers had their sort of private gardens that they used for those sort of some purposes to display their wealth and have areas for them specifically to kind of relax in and decorate their homes and palaces with and things like that. So that was pretty common in that era. Here's another example of another little private area. This is actually a little bit older garden of I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, but 2050 BC. This is actually, I think this is actually like a model that is coming from this textbook that I use, but this is actually, it's a picture of like a little wooden model that they created that represented the um, actual garden here. So that was pretty common in Egypt. They use that in terms of or the antiquity where we're seeing this sort of overlaps with Egypt too, but areas like Persia and Greece and Rome. The Persian Empire, there's a lot of similarities in how their cities sort of reflected what was going on in Egypt as well. So they had palace gardens, and they were using them in similar ways. It was the ruling class and they were trying to sort of display how much wealth they had and create, these nice environments for them to hang out in, not really open to the public. But these were much greater extravagance. There was a lot more wealth, inequality, I guess, in the Persian Empire, and so there was a lot of wealth sort of concentrated within the ruling class, and so they used that to create some much more extravagant gardens, like palace gardens. In Greece, it was actually a little bit of a different thing going on in Greece. So, first of all, Greek towns were surrounded by these things called green belts of vegetation, and they were composed of garden plots and suburban orchards. So, basically, their towns had these like sort of I don't know if they were agricultural fields, but they were kind of like mixed forest and agriculture that would surround their towns, and they would actually have garden plots in there, and sometimes they would have like individual like families would have garden plots and stuff like that. And so, and something else worth mentioning is that the disparity of wealth was probably not as great in early Greece. So, Greece is one of the more early forms of a kind of democracy. And so, in early Greece, the ruling class, while they were probably much better off than the rest of the public, there wasn't as much of a divide as in some of these other early areas where the wealth was just highly concentrated at the top of the ruling class. And so, in early Greece, there actually aren't as many examples of like really extravagant gardens, like palace gardens and stuff. Now later on, that actually changed. So as Greece sort of came into a little bit more prominent power, they started expanding and like getting exposed to the Persian Empire and Egypt, and they like actually saw some of these gardens. So later on in Greece's history, they actually did try to sort of copy some of the gardens that they came across in the Persian Empire and in Egypt. And so they ended up, yeah, so here they were influenced by the Persian palace gardens after their conquests. And they tried to incorporate that a little bit, but they also, they had, Greece is sort of known for being one of the early areas that really prioritized education, not for all of its citizens, but for some citizens, if you were privileged enough. But they put a lot of wealth into and time and energy into making these academies places, where people could relax and focus on learning and things. So a lot of their gardens were concentrated in these sort of academies. And so this is just sort of an example of an academy that was outside of Athens. And it's kind of interesting. They had these like walkways, and I forget what they called them, like the Scholars Walk or something like that, where these walkways were actually you had a path, but they were like through the woods. It was almost like a nature trail that you would walk on from the city out to this academy, where the academy had like its own gardens and probably botanical gardens and things like that. So it was interesting and maybe comparable to what you might find. Um, in a university setting, or if you walk around campus here on IU, you see all sorts of planted flowers and trees and things like that. So probably a similar sort of thing going on there. Rome was sort of kind of a combination, maybe between what was going on in Persian empires, but also reflected some of what Greek culture was. They were also surrounded by these green belts of large private estates. And from the first century onward, were mostly under the control of the emperor. So what they had these green belts, but they were mostly like not really accessible to the public. Some of them were later on, but they had like these private villas for Roman like military leaders and stuff that would be out there, and they would have their own like little vacation homes and things. And so it wasn't really something that they were incorporating sort of into the city or as a public amenity for the most part. Now, what's interesting though is that they did actually recognize that the having those green belts around the city actually did improve the air quality of Rome, and there's actually references to this from records of the Roman Senate, and that they were aware of having this that it was actually an improvement, and I think that played a role in how they did or did not develop some of those greenbelt areas as Rome expanded. So that's kind of interesting. But they also had, this is sort of a layout. It's kind of hard to see what's going on here, but like here's a layout of a Roman home, and you had like this area was like the orchard, like a private orchard, and then there was a garden like sort of in the center of it. So they were not really they had, there was urban vegetation, but it wasn't really accessible to a lot of the public, and that's kind of the story for a lot of these early areas, other than maybe a little bit of Greece, is that while there was vegetation in these urban areas, they weren't. It's not like it was something that anyone they didn't have parks that anyone could go to and sort of hang out in.